At this time, we'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Julia Hopkins. She's an assistant professor at Northeastern University studying the physical underpinnings and design parameters of nature-based solutions for climate-changed coastal communities. After finishing her PhD in the MIT-WHOI Joint Program in 2017, she spent 3 years in the Netherlands to investigate sand-based flood protections at the TU Delft. Since her return to Boston, Massachusetts, she has used this experience as a co-founder of the nature-based coastal infrastructure startup called the Emerald Tutu.
As faculty at Northeastern, her research focuses on adapting nature-based resilience solutions to the varied coastal communities of the world. Current and forthcoming projects include studying the physical mechanisms which allow floating wetlands to prevent coastal inundation, characterizing the compounded effects of waves and currents on shoreline evolution, developing design parameters based on stakeholder feedback to climate change scenarios, and developing novel field observation techniques to observe beach changes during extreme weather events such as hurricanes. And with that, I'll introduce Dr. Julia Hopkins.
Thank you so much. Oh, hello, the microphone works now. Thank you, guys. So, I'm going to take my mask off for the sake of you all hearing me. We do get tested once a week at Northeastern, so I have been negative for COVID, which is good for everyone here. And let's just start by grounding ourselves a little bit. So this is the first talk of the MIT Water Summit. So where are we? We are in Cambridge, we are at MIT, and we are standing on reclaimed marshland. This is sea level, if not below. When we talk about the problem of coastal resilience, we're talking about places like MIT, where if the water were to rise, it would come right here. And that's sort of the context I want you to keep in mind as we start talking about the mechanisms by which we might want to encourage or design around coastal resilience. So my talk today is going to focus on what we call nature-based solutions. Now we'll get into those definitions in a couple of slides. This is going to be looking at a couple of different types of nature-based solutions, looking at the problems in terms of coastal resilience that we hope they will solve. And what I want you to leave this talk with is both some optimism about the potential we have for nature-based solutions to help us fight back sea level rise and intensified storms, as well as a healthy skepticism of what we know about how these solutions will perform and what we still need to learn to be able to design these solutions effectively. So in the slide behind me, you have a bunch of different images, all of which I will get to over the course of this presentation. And you have a little badge that says Cures, and that's just representative of my lab at Northeastern. I'm the assistant professor of the Coastal Urban Resilience and Environmental Solutions Lab. And the lab itself has contributed a lot to the work I'm going to show you today. Let's begin. What's our coastal climate future? We're currently standing on reclaimed marshland. What else might be happening in the near future? Well, the images I'm showing you in this particular slide are model projections of, on the left-hand side, water level around one urban environment, New York City, projected out to say 2015 or 2100. And then on the right hand, we have temperature anomalies, this time modeled for the Boston area. This indicates weather extremes and how we expect them to become more intense. So sea level rise and weather extremes are likely to be in our urban coastal climate changed future. In addition, we're looking at a future that's going to have some fairly drastic shoreline change. Because of climate change, we anticipate more frequent and more intense storms like hurricanes. The storms we already get do something like the damage you can see in the image behind me. This is a piece of a beach at South Carolina after Hurricane Matthew. So before image on the top, after image on the bottom. The hurricane came through, it moved foundations, it moved houses, it moved sand, it moved the shoreline, and it fundamentally changed the characteristics of the shoreline in this particular area. We anticipate changes like this to be more frequent and occurring all along the East Coast of the United States, the West Coast of the United States, and the Gulf Coast, not to mention all around the world. And then we're just gonna have flooding. We're going to have flooding owing to storms, like you can see in the image to the left that just popped up. And then we're also going to have flooding, just nuisance flooding, daily flooding. As sea levels rise, we're going to still have tides. We're going to have more instances of waters just coming along shore in urbanized coastal areas. And all of these are going to cause a host of problems. You can imagine that a lot of the infrastructure we have designed right now, a lot of the civil infrastructure, was never really designed to be wetted and then dried, and then wetted and then dried. There's likely to be some amount of infrastructure failure that we can't yet anticipate because we don't know that cycle of wetting and drying. We don't know how high the waters are going to come, when, or where. Working on it, but we don't know it just yet. And this is the climate change future that we have to deal with in the field of coastal resilience. So, what do we do? Well, we have some solutions. We have some solutions that have been already implemented in several scenarios and are proposed to be implemented in the near future. These solutions consist of things that have already happened that we typically call hard solutions. These are what you'd normally think of when you think of flood resilience or coastal resilience. These solutions are like the levees in New Orleans or the Thames River Barrier or anything the Dutch have done in the Netherlands, really. These are solutions that are civil infrastructure. They're concrete, they're sand, they're barriers. They're meant to keep the water out. We have design parameters for them. We can design them to spec for a given amount of water level. We can put them in place, we know how much that's going to cost, and we can wait to see if the water level gets any higher. We can hope that it doesn't. Because these solutions, while they work to what they are designed to do, are very difficult to adjust, especially if our design parameters are going to have a certain amount of uncertainty, like they will when it comes to coastal climate change. We know the sea levels are going to rise. We don't know necessarily how much or when, especially in enough certainty that we can design around. So hard solutions, they tend to work. You look out in New Orleans, you see the levees, you think, that's keeping water out, and it absolutely is, but it might not for as long as we anticipate it to. So what do we do then? Well, in the coastal engineering field, we've been discussing and turning towards more what we call soft solutions. So these are solutions that aren't concrete, aren't sand, they're more like dynamic solutions that try to work with some type of nature. They involve things like seagrass restoration, marsh restoration, mangrove restoration, or room for the river. So designing communities such that you have anticipated flood patterns and you design such that people can live and exist and work around places that you intend to flood. These solutions, as you might imagine just from that one description, tend to be multidisciplinary. You need to engage policymakers in addition to civil engineers. You need to engage ecologists in addition to policymakers. And you need to engage the people who live there, because if you're going to move them, they should probably know, and they should also probably agree. Both of these solutions, on their own, might not be sufficient, especially in a place like we're standing right here. If we wanted the soft solution, if we wanted to restore the marsh around Boston, taking this building and moving it, because this is the marsh. As a coastal engineer, when it comes to urbanized areas, we need to think more creatively than either just hard solutions or just restoring the natural protective measures. We need a combination. We need some sort of engineered, nature-inspired solution that can work with both of these together. So, let's see if that works. That works. All right. There are a couple of examples of things that people have tried to design or are designing that are something of a hybrid, taking some idea of what the natural environment will do and then implementing it in a more urbanized environment. There are a couple examples in the images behind me. I'm going to highlight a few of them. One is over to the right. This is the idea of oyster reef restoration. This has particularly been suggested for New York City to prevent against flooding similar to what happened in Hurricane Sandy in 2012. And the idea is pretty simple. You'd put a bunch of oysters in the benthic environment offshore of the city or in the Hudson River. And so that's along the bed. You have a bunch of new oyster growth. You have a bunch of restored oyster forests. And they're at the bed level, so that increases the roughness of the bed. And when a storm comes through, the waves and the surge have to travel over all of these oysters before it reaches the shoreline. And the hope and the idea is that will help to impede the wave attack, the storm surge, and thus the flooding. Another sort of offshoot of this is something called artificial reefs, similarly looking to restore the benthic environment to increase the roughness, to give some impedance to incoming storm waves and surge. And then, of course, we have the restoration of natural systems and this idea of living shorelines, which instead of restoring the benthic environment, so the seafloor, would put some measure of vegetation around the shoreline itself, usually to anchor the shoreline and prevent erosion, not necessarily to directly prevent flooding. So there are all of these ideas. You can see them in the images behind me. Why haven't any of them gone into the water yet? So I have a couple of carefully selected highlights from the New York Times, which is near and dear to my heart because I grew up in New York City. And when Hurricane Sandy hit in 2012, everyone agreed, stakeholders, people living there, government officials, we need to do something. We need to make sure the lower half of Manhattan doesn't flood like that again, and we don't have millions of people lose power again because you cannot evacuate New York City. So all of these ideas, the oyster reef, these green living shorelines that could surround the urban environment, all of these ideas came into play and people started thinking and designing and modeling, and yet we are almost 10 years away from Hurricane Sandy and nothing's in the water. So what are the challenges? What challenges exist to putting nature-based solutions in the water? I'm gonna highlight a few of the big ones here. The first, cost-benefit analysis. Now I'm an engineer, so I'm sort of stepping into territory here that I understand enough of to be dangerous and to try and work with, but not enough of to give a complete overview. So with that addendum, what I understand about the cost-benefit analysis when it comes to nature-based solutions is that we don't yet know how much they're gonna cost, because it's very difficult to design around the amount of uncertainty that we have in terms of how they're going to perform. And we also don't have a very clear handle on what they're going to do to benefit the local community. The potential is a lot. When you put vegetation on the shoreline, you can imagine probably some water quality benefits, maybe even some carbon offsets, maybe even a lovely green space for people to explore who live in the local area. That's all co-benefits. Those are all things that should be going into the benefit of nature-based solutions in addition to anticipated flood attenuation. But try putting a number to that. We're working on it. We don't quite have those numbers solid enough to make this analysis. At the same time, we have the problem of regulation. In Massachusetts, a lot of the regulation when it comes to putting coastal resilient structures into the water or on the shoreline were designed around hard solutions. They were designed around groins and jetties and seawalls and things that we can see and things that we know how much water they can keep out. And they were designed to offset the unintended consequences of these types of hard structures. We don't yet know what the unintended consequences are of the soft structures, so it's very difficult to have a regulatory framework around this just yet. Again, things we're working on, but things that still need to be dove into. And then, of course, there's the uncertainty. Climate change is going to be uncertain of itself, and if we're looking at nature-based solutions, we're looking at solutions that likely involve plants. Plants need to grow, plants need certain environmental conditions to thrive. They're not quite as easy to design as a couple blocks of concrete. There's uncertainty in the design process, and there's uncertainty in the conditions the nature-based solutions will have to guard against. And then finally, stakeholder engagement comes into all of this. When we put nature-based solutions in the water, it needs to protect shoreline communities of all kinds. Not just the people who can afford it, because the coastline doesn't care where those people live. Also the people who can't afford it. Also the people who are just renting as opposed to owning the houses. Also the financial districts, also the poor communities on the sides of the financial districts. Everyone has a stake in this, and everyone needs to be engaged when it comes to designing these solutions and then finally putting them in the water. And the solutions need to be designed such that they match the expectations and needs of the communities they're going to be designed for. So these are the challenges. Just a few, actually, but some of the big ones. What are the opportunities? Turns out, a lot. A lot is being done in the coastal resilience engineering field right now to address these challenges. And they tend to happen on two parallel tracks. That's sort of the blue arrows back here. The first track is understanding the solution space. That's the science, that's the physics. What are we trying to design around? What parameters do we have to design around? What do the solutions look like and how will they perform? That's the first track. And the second that needs to happen in parallel is the engagement of the stakeholders, because you can design the perfect solution, but if no one wants it, then it's not going to be working. So let's go back to that slide for a little bit, because there's a few more things that are happening in the coastal resilience space to understand both of these tracks. The first is we've had more engagement than ever in the idea of coastal resilience, the idea that we need to protect the 40% of the population living within 60 miles of the shoreline. And that's looking at a local scale, at a national scale, at an international scale. And the fact that people are engaged is very good in terms of that track of stakeholder engagement and community engagement, and getting that feedback back that we need to design these solutions. And then we also have advances being made in the science itself. One of them is remote sensing. We have more tools than ever to view how the coastline responds to things like hurricanes. And these tools help us to image the coastal state, its evolution, what's causing that evolution, and maybe even sometime soon what that evolution looks like during a storm event, which will give us invaluable data as to what we are designing for and what we are designing against. The underpinning, the why and the how of what the coastal resilience needs to protect against. And then we also have citizen science. It's a word that's coming up a lot in the field, and it's actually being used to good effect in places like Australia, which is the image you can see behind me. This is a little snapshot of a project called Coast Snap, where installations on beaches encourage beachgoers to take their smartphones and just take images of the beach state and then send them to the cloud or send them to social media. And the researchers can mine that and get actually a very comprehensive time series of how a beach or a marsh or wherever you put these things are is evolving over time. Valuable data to understand the natural environment and to understand the environment we are trying to design around. So these are the opportunities. And today I'm going to share with you how one example of these opportunities, how these opportunities can come together in a particular nature-based solution, because it is important that we are very concrete when we talk about what types of solutions we are designing. So I'm going to give you one, and this is the one, of course, near and dear to my heart, because it's the one that I've been working on. It's called the Emerald Tutu. The Emerald Tutu is a team. It's my lab at Northeastern University, and it's the Emerald Tutu. It's a small startup that's been working to design these types of nature-based solutions that you can see in the images behind me. So what is it? What is a tutu? It's a play on the emerald necklace, which if you live in Boston, you probably get more readily than someone who lives in, for instance, San Francisco. So it's a play on the emerald necklace. It's the Emerald Tutu. It's meant to be a series of interlinked, floating, vegetated mats that are deployed in the near shore with the idea that the density of the vegetation of the mats and the network effects, the fact that they're connected and interlinked together, will help to dampen wave energy and potentially storm surge from hurricanes or more intensified storms as they approach urban environments. You can see in the top image behind me, just a cross-shore section of the Emerald Tutu, give you a better idea of what's going on, where we go from the shoreline, which is on the left-hand side, all the way over to the near shore, and you see just a row of these mats linked together and anchored to the sea floor. And then at the bottom, artist's rendition of an entire section of these mats deployed outside of East Boston, which illustrates not only the mats and what they would look like linked together, but also how we anticipate the community interacting with the mats. We hope that the Emerald Tutu solves a couple of the challenges that I outlined in terms of barriers to putting nature-based solutions in the water. The Emerald Tutu is modular. It's a bunch of mats. We can put them in one by one. You can pay for them one by one. Modularity helps us to be more flexible when it comes to the design space and design around a bunch of different needs in terms of what the shoreline looks like. Is the shoreline fully urbanized? Are there marshlands we're designing around? Are there shipping lanes we're designing around? All of these things come into play with the modularity of the tutu. The tutu is made of natural materials. No plastic, or as little plastic as possible. The ropes might have a bit of plastic in them. But the idea is if a tutu breaks off, for whatever reason, it can float away, no impact to the environment, or at least very little. It will degrade, it will sink. It's made of vegetation that is natural to the environment that it is placed, hopefully providing more benefits than not. Speaking of co-benefits, because the Emerald Tutu is designed to be vegetated with natural species, we anticipate that there will be benefits to water quality, benefits to carbon sequestration, benefits to beautifying a shoreline that may have previously been armored or more urbanized. All of these go into the co-benefits for the community. And it's designed for urban coastal resilience, and it's designed to be something that is attractive to local stakeholders and also adaptable to local stakeholder feedback. So, I just told you what it's designed to do. What does it actually do? We tested that. One of the things the Emerald Tutu is working on right now is getting numbers for everything I just said. So today I'm going to show you two of the tests. One, the physics, so how well does it actually attenuate wave energy? Two, the ecology, so how well does it actually grow anything in this urban East Boston waters? We want to know these to precise detail so we can design an Emerald Tutu system that we know will be efficacious in attenuating waves in urban environments. We are not going to try and put this in the water until we think it works. So our first test was this past summer in the O.H. Hinsdale Wave Basin in Oregon State University, which is this massive basin that you can see behind me. It's usually meant to simulate unidirectional waves, just very large waves. They use it to test tsunami effects on various, small little scaled cities. We used it to test wave attenuation of a 50% scaled Tutu network. The Tutu network itself are all of the little yellow things you can see in the images behind us. So the image to the top right is the full scale of the basin. This is a camera that exists on the wall, and it's looking at the entirety of the basin. WaveMaker on the way back of the basin where you can see the OSU banner, and the beach is closest to us in the water. So the waves go from the back to the front across the Tutu mats. Down here, just at the bottom image here, you can see the mats themselves. They are made of a couple of different materials. You have some rain screen, that's the yellow thing on the top, that's imitating vegetation that we anticipate would grow above the Tutu mats. And then you have some tulle on the bottom that's imitating what we anticipated would be the vegetation growing below the mats. We have 44 of these mats. They're connected together. They're anchored to the bed of the basin itself. We have gauges measuring the waves before the mat network, gauges measuring the waves after the mat network. And this past summer, we ran a suite of regular waves, single waves, random waves, all sorts of wavelengths, all sorts of wave heights, and we measured what it was that was determining how the network behaved and how it attenuated wave action. Preliminary results. So we got one figure here. That's okay. It suggests a couple of different things. This is one figure of many that I could be showing you, but we're going to start with this one. X-axis, wavelength. Many different wave heights are incorporated in these little dots, but we are going to go with the dependency on wavelength because it determined that that was one of the key measures of how well the mat network performed. So x-axis is wavelength, how long the waves were as they approached the mat network. Y-axis, wave attenuation in percentage. So the higher the dot, the more wave energy was attenuated after the waves passed through the mat network. What does this show us? Actually fairly encouraging results. We were quite happy with this. It shows us that in certain instances, with short enough wavelengths, 50% scaled mats, we can attenuate 90% of the wave energy, if not more. It shows us, unsurprisingly, that as the waves get longer and longer, that energy attenuation decreases. Once the waves become so long that they're bigger than the mat network itself, the wave attenuation drops to zero, and that's all shown in the decline behind me. What does this mean? Well, it seems as if, from our preliminary results, that if the waves are about the mat size or shorter, we're going to catch all of them. If the waves are about the mat network length or shorter, we're going to catch most of them. And after that, we're going to catch very little. That gives us something to design around. That gives us an idea of how we can design the network, the mat sizes, how the mats are linked together based on the storm conditions that we want to attenuate. And so we're designing that. We're designing that by putting the results from our lab tests into a non-hydrostatic numerical model, a little image of which you can see up here in the upper right-hand corner. The green dots are the Tutu network, the simulated Tutu network. The color contours are water levels. So you see one wave that's starting to come through and towards the Tutu network. And the numerical model has been validated by all the tests that we ran at Oregon State University. In the verification, I'm just showing you two very quick little plots down here. Time on the x-axis, wave height on the y-axis, before and after the network for model in red and data in blue. So we have a numerical model. It's being spun up for this MAT network, and we're going to use it to test a bunch of different network configurations, sizes, and MAT sizes to figure out the full design parameter space for what the network can look like to attenuate the largest amount of wavelengths. In concert, we had a couple of different prototype tutus that we put out in Boston. I'm showing you the one that was in East Boston because it has some of the more interesting results. These prototypes were not meant to be the physical prototypes. We weren't testing whether or not they would attenuate waves. We were testing whether or not and what they would grow and how long they would last. So we had a guess. We had a couple of good guesses, mind you, at what the material composition we wanted to be in the mats to encourage this kind of growth. We had our initial prototype mat, which is on the left-hand side here. We put that out next to one of the piers in East Boston, and we left it for about 2 to 3 to 4 months. After 2 months, it looked like what you can see on the right-hand side. You can see on the top image to the right, there's a lot more greenery growing on the top. Not very long, mind you, but there's still some. It's encouraging growth, and we have some samples of that right now that we are currently analyzing. Now, it's a little bit harder to see because it was under the water, but the shocking thing from the East Boston prototype was that the amount of vegetation growth under the mat was spectacular. So in the Oregon State University prototype, we had the little tool strings, sort of simulating submerged vegetation. Turns out those should have been like large blocks of canvas because that is more akin to the physical reality we were seeing in the field. It seems as if that submerged vegetation is actually going to be a significant part of the mass density of these mats, which is good for us because we hypothesize that likely encourages a lot more wave attenuation than we were measuring in our physical wave basin tests. So moving forward, given the physical tests we've done so far, given the ecological tests we've done so far, we're going along both of these tracks. So the understanding of the solution space and now the engagement, now that we have an idea and some confidence that our hypotheses are playing out. We're going to go back to Oregon at some point in the near future, hopefully this summer, to start testing the role of the submerged vegetation in wave attenuation, so testing different densities and layers of that submerged vegetation to really hone in on physically what it's doing. We're going to expand our model to be regional, to be coastal, so that we can start putting in little tutu configurations and networks all around places like Boston and figure out what types of hurricane wave energy that is likely to attenuate and get out the very interesting question of whether or not this can actually do anything about storm surge. It's an open question that we are currently studying. And then pilot Tutu network, and here's the community engagement, because we're working with places like certain communities in the Cape Cod right now to put in pilot networks of 60 to 100 mats, test not only the ecology, but also the robustness over time and the physical implications of what happens when you put one of these things in the water. So we're working with local communities to get that done right now. And that's an example. The Emerald Tutu is an ongoing project that we are looking at as a nature-based solution to help us design with uncertainty. Design with the idea that the future is uncertain, and thus our solutions also need to have a certain amount of uncertainty in how they're going to behave and how they're going to adapt to the coming climate-changed world. One last example of that uncertainty is the image to the right here, where we have ensemble of climate model simulations. At the top is mean sea level rise projections, and at the bottom is the root mean squared, or a measure of the error or the uncertainty in the sea level rise projections. You'll notice they're on the same scale. That's the uncertainty we're trying to design around. And we have all of these potential solutions that you can see on a little bit on the left-hand side here, the Emerald Tutu is likely to be a part of a much broader set of potential solutions to prevent coastal flooding. You might have, in the end, an urban area with a tutu, and then an oyster farm out in the deeper waters, and then a living shoreline to prevent some erosion. And you might need these tiered approaches to actually protect an urbanized community. But for all of them, any of them, we are encouraging modularity, the ability to adapt to local stakeholder feedback. We are encouraging testable. We want these solutions, whatever they are, to have been tested such that we know what their efficacy is and we have some parameters designed around. And we want them to be deployable. That is the goal for nature-based solutions, and that is what the Emerald Tutu is working towards and what my lab is also working towards. So that's it for me. Thank you all so much for coming, and I will take any questions.
I'll come around with the mic if you raise your hand and have a question. If not, you can scan the QR code on the back of the seats and type in your questions via Slido. I'm gonna go here first.
How about trash? The collection of trash onto all those lovely little modules. Have you experienced what the effect of trash, that's a variable, would be on these little modular islands?
Yeah, so it would probably, so we've only had individual mats out thus far in the actual near shore. So we haven't really seen much accumulation, but it's only because, it's one mat and you'd expect, there's a lot more plastic, for instance, being tossed elsewhere. It is entirely likely that, it will be a place where you do get a bit of inland trash collected. That's perfectly fine. We can work that into the maintenance plan for sure. It's not designed to collect plastic by any means, but if it happens to, then you just pick it up.
Thank you. What is the consideration around recreational and commercial boat travel through the harbor spaces? And are these removable in channels, or can you construct them around the boat channels or distance-wise? Thanks.
No, that's a fantastic question. And that is something that we've definitely been considering in terms of the design, because it's something that stakeholders are very concerned about, as they should be. So these are modular and movable. You can deploy them very quickly, and you can also tighten their connections with each other to create channel spaces when, for instance, they don't need to be in place to protect against some sort of storm. So it's likely that we'll be working to keep major shipping channels free. And when it comes to smaller boat traffic, we'll work to make sure that it can be arranged in such a way that this traffic is allowed out when there's no threat of storm, and then we can close it up when there is threat of storm.
I have a question from the webcast. Have you received any feedback from policymakers at this point, or the Department of Energy or Environment?
No feedback from the Department of Energy, as far as I know thus far. Policymakers at certain levels, yes. So we've been in touch with a bunch of the Charles River Conservancy, for instance, and Mystic River Conservancy, and some communities, so local town managers up and down the Massachusetts coast. Generally, people are very enthusiastic about this kind of thing. The people who part of the reason no regulation is a bit of a problem is because there definitely are some regulatory barriers to putting something like this out in the water. We are working to overcome those barriers through a pilot test deploy, where we can better demonstrate what this does and what sort of unintended consequences the regulatory space might actually want to be working around. But it's an ongoing process, and we are definitely, I am at Northeastern working with a lot of people in the policy space to better understand how we can communicate and work to put nature-based solutions in the water. And so again, it's the two tracks. It's both the understanding the science and then also understanding how to actually make this benefit people.
I have another question. So this one is from me. So I'm really curious as to how you, how did this idea start? I know that it started when you were at MIT. I'm just curious on the inception of this whole thing.
Yeah, so it's a multidisciplinary phenomena, I guess. I was in the Netherlands at the time, but I was in touch with people at MIT because I had just finished my PhD here. And the founder of the Emerald Tutu, so if you look up the Emerald Tutu, you'll see the CEO. His name is Gabriel Sira. He was an architecture student here at MIT, and he had this idea that he wanted to do something to beautify the spaces around the shorelines and to maybe have some impact on water quality, maybe have some impact on coastal resilience. So he sort of he did all the renditions for what it's worth, so that's why they look so gorgeous. He had this idea of this tutu, this more proletariat. These are his words, not mine, but it's sort of supposed to be a more like funky community space in contrast with the Emerald Necklace, which was really designed to be a bit more sort of high class. This was designed to be a little bit more community centered and just kind of quirky. And it was an landscape architecture project to begin with. And then he thought, wait a minute, it's in the water. Maybe I should be talking to some people who work in the hydrodynamic and coastal engineering space, and that's where he brought me in. And I looked at it and I thought, wait a minute, it's interlinked together. These are dense vegetated mats. I know just enough about vegetation in the water to know that they tend to do something with the wave energy. Maybe we can work with that. And in 2018, we put together a small submission to an MIT competition. We won the competition. We let it kick around for 6 months, and we came back. We were like, wait a minute, this could actually work. Let's go find out.
I love that because Autumn is a civil engineering student and I'm the architect, so future. Anyway, I have another great question. Excuse me, so do you know at this stage, you talked a lot about like the kind of design parameters and how you would maybe calibrate the mats based on wavelength. This one actually is from me. So do you know at this stage like what the mat network would have to look like in the local condition? Like what kind of is the spectrum of wavelengths that we're dealing with in the Boston Harbor?
Yeah, so I can say wavelength in terms of wave period. These two things are linked, but not precisely the same. So a wave period is the amount of time it takes for one crest to pass, then another crest to pass. And so longer wave periods mean longer wavelengths. We tend to see like 10 to 15 second wave periods at most if we're talking about like really big storm waves. Boston Harbor is funky because we have all of the Boston Harbor Islands. So one of the projects that we are thinking about right now, and one of the projects that my lab has been deploying a few instruments around, is trying to see what happens to the waves during hurricanes. I think I actually have this is a slide. Haha, look at this. All right, so this image up here, just to the left, is an image of a little sensor that we deployed in anticipation of Hurricane Henri in the Boston Harbor. And it's a sensor that measures wave heights. The idea is that whenever we get an idea that a hurricane is approaching or a big storm is approaching, we run around the Boston Harbor, we get permission from whomever we can, we deploy these sensors to measure what the waves are doing as they come into the harbor, which will help us figure out what the conditions are that we're trying to design around here. And then the idea is we'd do something similar to any other location that was interested in having a tutu, including places like the Cape, which, for better or for worse, good for us, are much more instrumented than around the Boston Harbor right now.
Awesome. I have a question up here.
So the nature solution is really cool because there's a potential for things to grow and change, but then it also comes with challenges because things are growing and changing. So on that point, what are some thoughts that you have on how to tackle challenges on unpredictable? Because now we have like multiple variables, not only your structure, but also the incoming event.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what makes this exceedingly exciting. So when it comes to the unpredictability in our structure, that's part of the reason we're doing all of these tests. We're doing more tests in terms of different mats, individual mats in different types of shoreline environments right now, because we want to get a sense of what could grow, what's going to grow, how best to seed these things before they go into the water, sort of encourage the types of growth that we want. And ideally, what we really want is natural species, that's kind of the big thing, and dense. So if we can get those two things, whatever those species are, we're pretty happy. Stakeholders might be different. So we're going to need to do some back and forth right there. And then the beauty of the tutu is that because it's modular, you can always put out more mats, take mats away, put out, like if, for instance, you're not getting quite the density you anticipated, put out more mats to artificially increase the density or link things together in slightly different ways in the network to encourage the wave attenuation that you'd want, even if the mats don't necessarily perform precisely as you would expect. One of the things we're doing right now is we're looking at the winter cycle in the Northeast. So the mats that are in the water during winter, how much vegetation do they sustain? How much density do they sustain? And what do we have to do to design around the fact that up here in the Northeast, we have seasons? But yeah, it's a very complex problem, but it's also a big opportunity in that particular space.
Awesome. We have another question up front.
Hello, good morning. If you have a great idea but people doesn't like it, you have a problem. How do you handle the testing and the prototype of this kind of ideas, this kind of innovation?
Sorry, what was the first bit of that question? If you have a blank. I didn't hear that bit.
Sorry, bear with me. English is not my first language.
No, my hearing is off. I apologize.
You just said, and it's very important, that if you have a great idea but people doesn't like it, then you have a problem. How do you handle the prototypes and the testing?
Yeah, so I think this is actually why multidisciplinary solutions are exceedingly important, because one of the beauties of the Emerald Tutu is that this is this marriage of landscape architecture, civil engineering, ecology, and each one of us is sort of tuned into different potential needs of the community. And as we've been designing this, we've been talking to people. We've been talking to people in the Cape, in Boston itself, Charles River Conservancy, Mystic River Conservancy, tried to get Massport. Logan Airport's very busy. But we've been really trying to shop this around to see what people are interested in, what they like about it, what they don't like about it, what their concerns are, and the whole goal is addressing these concerns. So if we have a solution and no one likes it, then we need to find another solution. And this is one so far that seems to be playing out.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you.
James, do we have a question down there from the webinar?
We do.
Okay.
Anonymous is asking, how does the sea bottom profile pose any challenges to the deployment, maintenance, operation of the Emerald Tutu?
So this is like my scientific baby right here, sea bottom profile. Bathymetry, how much it changes, why it changes, what's causing it to change, will it be muddy, will it be sandy? The answer is maybe. The current design for the anchor system is actually artificial reefs. So we're trying to build on other potential nature-based solutions to anchor this down and encourage benthic habitat growth. Now, in some areas, that's going to be sufficient. In some areas, that won't be sufficient because the profiles and the materials of the benthic environment are going to be different. The good news is that as long as our anchors are deep enough, if the profile changes in any way, shape, or form, perfectly fine, as long as we can anticipate that change. If they're too shallow, they might get eroded, picked up, and tossed away. However, the better news is that the maritime industry has a lot of practice with anchoring systems in a bunch of different conditions. So we are taking many of our cues from, for instance, the harbors, the ports, the yacht clubs around here.
Awesome. We have a question here now.
Hi, Julia. Thank you so much for sharing your work today. I think it's really interesting how you've taken an iterative approach to testing the tutus. And I was wondering, are there different systems, for lack of a better word, currently installed in the water that you can get data from to help inform some of your testing? Something that comes to mind for me is docks. Like they have a similar mechanics, I would say, to how you're describing your tutus. So just curious if you could like put sensors on those and learn from that or anything else.
Yeah, no, actually floating docks is a very good idea. We don't currently have sensors on physical analogs of the tutu in the water right now, but it's possible that floating docks would give us some idea of what's going on. That's not a bad idea at all. I will think about that. At the moment, we just have our actual prototypes in the water, and we're observing those. And then we have the idea that if we wanted to test any sort of network effects, we'd want to have a large mass of a canopy to sort of figure out how things are moving in relation to each other. But any more opportunities that we have to deploy things. And of course, as my lab goes out and deploys other instruments for other purposes, we are mining that data to understand the natural environment as well.
James, do we have a question from the webcast?
I do. How much active upkeep is necessary to maintain the Emerald Tutu network? You may not know this yet, but...
That is,
Curious.
we don't know this yet, I will have to say, yes. So the 2-month growth that we saw in the prototype in East Boston, we left for Oregon and came back. And we I think I had one of my students walk out at one point, just make sure it was still there and kept going. So not a whole lot of maintenance or upkeep to get it to grow anything. Anyone who's worked in the water around here will tell you that if you put something in the water, you're just gonna get random amounts of biofouling. And we really wanna use that. We want to use the biofouling as a way to make these mats very dense. Now, when it comes to an entire network, we anticipate that, for instance, over the course of seasons, you're probably going to need some maintenance. You're probably going to need some sort of aerial imaging to get a sense of the extent of the mat network and to get a sense of where all of the units are and what their conditions are. So another thing my lab is working on is remote sensing technology, both to understand wave physics and current physics, but also to start to see how the shoreline is changing and start to get better resolution of different shoreline changes so we can monitor the tutu. And part of our pilot deploy will be this monitoring system so that we can figure out what happens to it over time and what the likely maintenance needs are going to be. The tutu units themselves are very low cost. We've been building them a couple $100 per unit at the moment, but that's not even at scale. That's just us in a lab with a couple of specified materials. But the idea is to make it very low cost and very easy to access for all sorts of communities.
Thank you. I can give you another one. So this is following up on the winter question. Will these still look reasonably attractive throughout the winter when they'll probably be the most useful against, say, nor'easters?
Will they still, well, maybe. That's a good question. Not entirely sure yet, actually. Will they still be as green? Actually, okay, so there's Northeastern, not my lab, but another lab at Northeastern. The student's name is Max Rome. Currently has a floating wetland analog just out in the Charles River right now. So he's actually been monitoring the growth of a bunch of different species on this floating wetland. And that has been out there for at least a year by now, I think. Or it started in the summer and we're going into the winter. So he's monitoring sort of the vegetation in the seasonal. So we're gonna get a sense of what this will actually look like. That's certainly a little bit prettier than a tutu is because some of those vegetation species have been cultivated or placed there to look very nice. But it's going to give all of us a sense of what floating vegetation looks like as you move through. That's an interesting question. Yeah, it's a good thing to think about.
We have a question over here.
Hello, I'm Jackie, and very interesting talk. I'm very curious about the specifics of the designs or the shape of the individual tutus. I was wondering whether your team has sort of worked with I guess other shapes rather than a circular as shown as in the renderings, or irregular shapes. Has that sort of come into consideration during the tests?
Yeah, absolutely. So circular shapes are by no means what we're wedded to. It just at the moment seemed like a very simple way to start. In reality, we expect slightly more oblong shapes. In fact, we saw that it deformed a little bit on its own in terms of the planar shape that you saw when it was out in East Boston. We expect that wave action and current action will sort of shift the material on the map around so that it's not ever really going to be precisely a circle, but probably more of a little bit of an oblong shape. Yeah. It's an interesting question. It'll be interesting to see, what causes a deformation. That's all just wave physics.
I have another one from online. Thank you. So let's see, these are both from the same person. So maybe this one's more specific and then maybe zoom out. So
Love it.
Do you have any hurricane wave sensing modules, say in the Narragansett Bay, and are the sensing modules biodegradable?
Sensing modules.
Maybe your remote sensing equipment.
Right. They're not, so they're cameras. Yeah, so they're not biodegradable, but they're also not in the water. So we're hoping that that's a reasonably good trade-off. We have, my student, Tyler, he has this little apparatus up here called the bird feeder. It currently doesn't have instruments in these two pictures, but it usually does. And it's a combination of a couple of GoPros, so co-located GoPros, and an ADV. And what he's doing is matching the surface signature of what the GoPros can see just above the water with the velocities the ADVs are measuring underneath the water. So we can start to translate that relationship and ideally obviate the need for the ADV in the end. The ADV is an acoustic Doppler velocimeter. It's a very expensive instrument that measures velocity. GoPros are very cheap instruments that do not measure velocity, but might measure visual cues that will give us velocity. That's what he's working on right now. So he's been deploying this all up and down the Massachusetts coastline and the Oregon coastline and getting a lot of good data from both. So we don't have any permanent structures out there yet, but we have, at the very least, this modular structure that's being moved around. And yes, ideally in the end, the remote sensing would be a combination of satellites and a combination of shore-based cameras, none of which are biodegradable, but also none of which should be captured and tossed into the ocean. So hopefully not necessary.
I'll go up to the upper corner next, but right here first.
Thanks for this talk. Really interesting stuff. You mentioned potentially testing down on the Cape.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about the dynamic of those conversations, who's involved? And also, I'm really curious about the potential co-benefit of nutrient remediation. You were talking about the growth on the bottom. I mean, the harbor probably has quite a few nutrients, so you're going to see nice growth.
Yeah.
But maybe in a place where there's not nutrients, which is a good thing, right? To an extent, you won't have as much growth. But really curious about the Cape and the prototyping and who's involved and just the nutrient conversation down there.
Yeah, so I'm not going to give specific names just yet, because until this goes into the water, part of the reason these negotiations are a bit fraught is because it's a very careful sort of balance of a bunch of different stakeholders. The stakeholders tend to include like the local harbor master, for instance, or someone who really works in the boating industry, especially around the Cape. Tends to include environmental groups that are very invested in the water quality and the ecology in the near shore. It tends to involve the local community, and like a lot of people who live on the shoreline really want something like this because they can see every day and every season the beach erode or the waters come up, and they really want something to help prevent that. So they're usually very for it. And then you have other interest groups that are a bit more cautious, as they should be. So what's been happening is that the team in the Emerald Tutu is fantastic and has done a really good job of contacting a lot of potential stakeholders in the local area. And some of them have responded positively and have responded with, yes, we can work with you to get these things in the water. And we're scoping out a given amount of time, a given space that everyone can live with for the prototype, and what the regulatory space looks like around a temporary installation, which is what this is. And one of the things that would be really cool, so we actually had one of our first physical prototypes was down in the Cape. So that one wasn't for as many months, so we didn't see quite as much growth. We did see some growth on this physical prototype, and it'll be interesting to compare the next prototype that we're putting in a freshwater system and in a estuarine system and another saline system around the Cape to see how the growth compares and how it compares over seasons, which is indeed a very important thing. Now, when it comes to urban protection, which is sort of one of the themes of this summit, the fact that there is a bunch of nutrient loading coming in and the fact that there are some water quality issues definitely works to our advantage, and we are going to use that. But yeah, all very good things to think about.
I just have to say these questions are amazing, and you are all such an engaged audience, so thank you. And we have another question up here.
Hi, thank you. I'll follow up on actually the gentleman's question.
Absolutely.
What kind of like economic or financial barriers do you foresee in the near future, especially as you think of like expanding the system?
Yeah.
And also primarily for like, again, the local stakeholders, like will they like bear the financial cost, or like will the larger urban community bear it, or like even on a federal level?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a non-traditional startup. We are a startup in name because we just started something, but we don't really have the whole venture capitalism backing, and we don't really want to be a company that tries to sell this for a large amount of profit. The idea, the economic model that we're starting to explore is one that's community-based. These things aren't difficult to fabricate. And our thought process at the moment is, if we can, and we are currently testing this, if we can figure out if, whether or not, and how much of a carbon offset they are, maybe we can use that as an economic model where we give them to the community and then have the carbon offset potential as one way of contributing funds for both the maintenance of the Tutu and for the community itself. So we're not in the business to make money, we're in the business to get these things deployed in the water. We're a bunch of scientists, landscape architects, and people who have healthy skepticism of how the system has been working thus far. So the economic model is something we're definitely exploring, and we'll get a better sense of it once we get past the pilot project phase. Very important question, though.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay, we have one more over here. And then James, you have one last one on the webcast? Okay, and then we'll wrap things up. But these questions have been awesome, and your presentation was amazing, Julia. I really enjoyed it, and it's clear that everyone else did too.
Yeah, these are really good questions. I'm very happy that everyone's thinking.
How can we help you? Those of us in the communities who say, can I be there when you're doing it, like on my shoreline, or can we watch, or can we help you?
Yeah, okay, wow. How can people individually here help? I mean, start to get a better sense of what Climate Ready Boston's gonna do. The infrastructure plans coming down the pipeline right now that's going to have something for coastlines. Make sure you're engaged your local communities. Make sure that you have an idea of what the city is going to do. And if, in the event, the tutu seems like it's a reasonable idea, you're welcome to come help us put it out and put it together. If I have good locations for the tutu deploys in hand, once we know where the pilot project is, of course, that will be on my lab's website, and you're welcome to visit it. The idea is that it is a place where people can go and interact with the shoreline. So honestly, spread the word. Spread the word and spread the idea that nature-based solutions, we need a healthy amount of research to figure out their efficacy, but there's some serious potential there, and we're working on it. Yeah, and I think everyone was probably working on it in a couple of different ways. Either you're in the science, or you're just living in the community, exceedingly valuable, or you're thinking about the future, and you're thinking about sort of what you want a coastal area to look like. All of that is incredibly helpful.
That was such a good question to end on. But I have one more that might also kind of give us a little tail end. So as far as all of the great work that you've shared about the project so far, how much preparation do you think from this point do you anticipate before deployment?
Before full deployment, we definitely need the pilot. Before the pilot, we actually are almost ready to go. So our numerical model is helping us to refine a lot of the big design parameter questions, and then the pilot, of course, will be testing a couple of very set questions that we have about how it performs all together in the real world, as it were. And then we also have a couple more lab tests that we are planning on. And after that, we start looking to the city of Boston saying, hey, do you want this?
Thank you so much. Everyone, please join in and thank Julia for coming to speak to us today.
Thank you all. Questions for me or anything that you'd like to talk about, my email is juhopkins@northeastern.edu. I would look forward to hearing from all of you.
Thank you, Dr. Hopkins, for that amazing talk. Yeah, and we could make sure we get everyone's contact info available. So at this time, we're going to take a break for lunch right outside in the auditorium in the Ting foyer. Our lunch today is catered by Revival Cafe. So a special thank you goes out to Nikki Buher for organizing our catering needs for the summit today.
In order to keep everyone safe, please only have your mask off if you are actively eating, distance yourself from others, and please spread out in the foyer, lobby, and the Diebold Lounge. Thank you, and let us know if you have any other questions. We'll be back here around 1:30 to kick off our next speaker. Thanks, everyone.